everyone. It's Tracy Potts with the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College, and I'm excited to lunch and learn with you today with my new friend, Joe Bubman. Joe is Executive Director of Urban Rural Action, and he's been a great partner with EI and for EI. Really working with students and working with the public as well, working with communities on how we can come together. You know, this is something we talk about a lot in society these days, how we can work together, particularly on issues where there is difference. Just last month, they did a workshop with our college and others called Dialogue Across Difference that I think is so important, Joe, for particularly what I like to call emerging leaders, right? Our college students who are about to go out into the world and face an area and face a society that can be very different from what they're used to. And we really have to build these skills on how to talk to each other, particularly on those topics that some of us may have experienced around the Thanksgiving table where people don't always agree. So I'm going to welcome Joe and tell me a little bit, first of all, about urban rural action and the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you and EI. Urban Rural Action's vision is a more peaceful, democratic, and just United States. And we aim to achieve that vision by bringing together Americans across lines of difference, across racial difference, political difference, geographies, generational difference, to build relationships, strengthen the collaboration skills that you're talking about, Tracy, explore different perspectives on issues, and then work together to address issues that impact all communities. We believe that if people work together across divides to solve problems, they can build relationships. And if they build relationships, they can better work together to solve problems.
So two things you said there that I think are key. And I just want to let folks who know and who have tuned in that we're going to be talking about how all of this relates to this upcoming one-year anniversary of January 6th and the insurrection and how really the work that you're doing is a foundation for moving us forward from that. But first, I really wanted to sort of explain to people the basics of not only what you do, but why you do it. You know, sometimes it sounds a lot easier than it is. This is really about skill building, isn't it?
That's a huge part of it. Let me take the first part of that question, Tracy, which is why we do this. And the reason that we do what we do is that the United States is in conflict. And there is a risk that what we saw on January 6th can become the norm rather than the exception. Much of my career has been spent in the international arena trying to prevent organized violence in places like East Africa, West Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America. Those regions experience conflict dynamics that we also see in the United States. And I think one of the mistakes that we make when we look back at January 6th and we say, oh, we are just too divided, is that we're looking narrowly at a complex problem, right? The conflict dynamics in our country are factors that exist across social, economic, political, and environmental systems. And so we want to understand that we experience widespread distrust of governing institutions in our country. We experience misinformation and disinformation. We experience isolation and loneliness. We experience divisive leaders who try to exploit our grievances for their political gain. And so skill building is a narrow solution to a narrow problem, and that's very much necessary in order for us to engage with people who have different perspectives. We need to follow that up with real concrete action, though, to address some of the dynamics that I've just articulated that cause political violence in our country and could cause more of that in the future.
I love that you talk about trust and that you talk about relationship building. I was just having this conversation with someone the other day. When you know someone, and maybe even better if you happen to like them, those conversations can actually start. Sometimes the conversations don't start and the listening part, which is so important, doesn't really happen until you see the person in front of you as a person and not just as an issue or a voice.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Tracy. And one of the problems that exists in our country is that we too often demonize and dehumanize people who see the world differently from we do, which is why a majority of liberals don't want their kids to marry conservatives, and a majority of conservatives don't want their kids to marry liberals. It's why over 75% of each party's members or voters sees supporters of the opposite party as a clear and present danger to American democracy. I think that another diagnosis, Tracy, that I would call out is that we spend too much time online with people who are similar to us and not enough time in person with people who are different from us. And so it's harder to build the sort of relationships that you're describing. And if we don't have those relationships, it's more difficult to listen to people who share different perspectives than our own.
So true. I can tell you as a journalist who, people forget that journalists are actually human beings behind their writing and behind
you are?
Yeah, exactly. We have families and, we go to the grocery store and that whole thing. But as someone who has managed both my professional and my personal social media, you certainly see that. People tend to be around others who are like them, who have similar thoughts. That's why we call them friends, whether virtual or in person. And so when you use social media as sort of a lens to the world, it is going to, it's self-reflective to some degree, right? It's going to reflect what you see. It's interesting though, I'm wondering how much that is changing, because I see a lot on the personal side of social media, a lot actually lately, where people are saying, I'm cleaning out my social media because of all of the people, who disagree with me. And what I'm hearing you say is maybe that's a really good basis for conversations.
And when you say a really good basis for conversation, do you mean the idea of maintaining a social network where you have people who have different views and you're exposed to those over time?
Exactly. Hopefully, if you can do it in a civil way, which is what part of the problem with social media, but a big part of what we do at EI and why we partner with you at Urban Rural Action. But yeah, I mean, if our world is just surrounded by people who look like us, I'll quote my mom. We all quote our mom at some point, right? But her thing to me when I was younger, she used to always say, if every flower in the garden looked the same, the garden wouldn't be as beautiful, right? And I think it's the same thing when it comes to voice on political issues and social issues. If we can maintain a broader network of people who think differently and can do so civilly, sometimes that makes for much richer conversations.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think one of the challenges is that when we are exposed to views online that we disagree with, our inclination is to reject those in favor of the views we already have. Mm-hmm. And so I think the connection that's important to make is to what you said earlier, Tracy, which is that the trust and relationships are really important, and the ability to engage constructively with people. And that's hard to do over Twitter or on Facebook. Sure. And you've mentioned the Dialogue Across Difference workshops. This is really an antidote to the tendency that we all have, which is to counter the view that someone has that we don't agree with our own view, and to argue back and forth about our different conclusions. We try to prove that they're wrong and we're right. We try to trap them into admitting that we are smarter than they are and they were wrong to challenge our perspective. And we end up damaging relationships. We end up frustrated and we don't want to engage with that person anymore. What we introduce in the Dialogue Across Difference workshops with EI, and we're thrilled that Gettysburg College has partnered with us for these workshops with institutions across the Mid-Atlantic, is we introduce a framework called the ABCs for constructive dialogue, where the A is asking questions to better understand someone else's view, B is breaking down your view so that they can understand your reasoning, and C is checking your understanding of their perspective, even if you don't agree. And we find that it's a memorable, accessible framework, not a list of the 23 things that you should do in any conversation, but the key thing is that rather than defaulting to just stating our point of view, we want to balance breaking down our view with asking questions about their view. We want to embrace a stance of curiosity. We want to check our understanding and be able to say, you know, Tracy, let me get this right. The causes that you see of January 6th are X, Y, and Z. Is that right? And I may agree or I may disagree, but I'm focused on your perspective, not just on articulating mine.
So I see two benefits to that. First, you really not only broaden your perspective, but you learn. You know, you walk into a conversation to learn and not just to explain and defend.
Right.
But the other thing is, in the process of asking me questions about my perspective, I may learn. Right? It's the non-challenge challenge. It's in a very non-threatening way, but I might start thinking, wait a minute, why do I believe that, or what is it based on? So it seems like there are a couple of different ways that could really foster greater understanding on both sides.
Yeah, and that's right. And if you're an EI emerging leader listening to this, you might be thinking, well, why should I even engage with this uncle or this aunt or this friend who doesn't listen to me? And my answer would be, it's possible that they don't listen to you because you don't listen to them. Yeah. And there is this norm of reciprocity in our society that is quite strong. If we engage other people with an open mind and a level of curiosity, and we ask the questions that you're talking about, Tracy, there's no guarantee that they will follow suit, but there is a greater likelihood that if we can demonstrate we care about their perspective, if we demonstrate that we want to understand how they see things, even if that's different from how we see it, they're more likely to ask some questions about our perspective and try to understand our point of view.
So let's move to how all of this relates to January 6th. You know, I think many people grew up in an era where they remember, where were you the day that Martin Luther King died, or where were you the day that Kennedy died? Where, you know, my era is, where were you on September 11th? And I think for Gen Z, it may be, where were you on January 6th? Of 2021. I certainly remember I was covering news that day, but I was working from home. But later that evening, I ended up down on Capitol Hill, which is where my basis of operations was at the time as a journalist. That said, as we move toward this first year, what have we learned? What should we be seeking to learn about this whole conversation and better dialogue based on what happened that day?
Yeah, that's a great framing, Tracy. And I would start with those of us who have been paying attention to conflict dynamics in our country over many years should not have been surprised by January 6th. And absent real action in our country, we can expect to see more episodes of political violence. I think that the causes of January 6th are very complex. And again, this is why I think it's simplistic to say our country is so divided. Our inability to talk to one another is what led to January 6th. I think that's one among many factors. But again, we need to look across systems. We need to understand that the trust in institutions that Americans have long held has declined considerably, right? People have less trust in our Congress. People have less trust in the legislature. People have less trust in the media and the judiciary. Yeah. There is more misinformation, more disinformation. People don't feel the same sense of community. We have less trust in our neighbors. We operate more in echo chambers than we did in the past, the way you were describing, Tracy. We feel less connected to our representatives. We have more access to violent weapons. I mean, there's a whole range of intersecting causes. And I know we're going to talk about the events that we're holding on January 6th.
Yeah.
I'm less interested in sort of myself coming up with the answers, which I don't have, and more interested in us as a society talking about January 6th, trying to examine what are the causes and effects of political violence and what can we do about them, because there's a whole range of actions that can be taken to address causes like misinformation, disinformation, loneliness, loss of trust in our institutions. This is a generational challenge. Like you said, it's a generational, where were you on this day? But unfortunately, there are likely to be more days like that unless we can really affect meaningful change that requires more than dialogue, but action at a local level to address local democracy challenges as well as nationally.
That's kind of a scary thought, but I appreciate your transparency about it as someone who has had many years of experience seeing what we are seeing now on our own turf in other areas around the world. And I think there are many colleagues, you and I have talked about this. There are other colleagues like you who have now spent many years around the world and are coming back into the United States, kind of scratching their heads saying, what I saw in a third world country is what I'm seeing in a school board meeting, right? And the same sorts of feelings and the same sorts of motivations and actions there. Help me understand, you described a world where people are experiencing mistrust and maybe feeling more insular as a result of that. I really kind of need to focus on me and my family and protecting what I have. But where's that link from that to violence, right? Because not everyone who feels that way storms the Capitol steps or picks up a weapon to do so, but it does happen. Where is that link? And I guess that's part of what we need to focus on preventing.
Yeah, that's a challenging question to answer, but I'll try to answer it in the following way, which is that there are different levels of support for political violence that we might measure, right? There are the people who are willing to storm the Capitol themselves, the people who are willing to inflict violence and use force against other people to overturn the outcome of the election. That's a very small minority of people in our country. But those people are supported by a larger percentage of people who condone that violence because they believe that we are facing an existential threat. They believe that our country is being ruined or destroyed by people from the other side. They are consuming information that maybe leads them to conclude that the election was fraudulent and needs to be overturned, and that our former president was the rightful victor of the election. There are people who, maybe just are so fed up that they think something needs to change. And so I do think that while it's unlikely we, those of us who are trying to advance a more peaceful, democratic, and just society, it's unlikely that we can sort of transform an individual who stormed the Capitol to someone who is engaging constructively to strengthen our democracy. I do think if we were to focus our energy on those people who maybe condone political violence or maybe think in some circumstances it might be warranted, if we can engage them more constructively, foster more meaningful relationships, expose those people to different perspectives, work with them to provide opportunities to engage in improving their democracy, I think that's at least a path forward, because I think the majority of people in our country, not every single person, but the majority want a peaceful, democratic, and just society. They want a society where the person who wins a plurality of votes becomes the president, and the party that wins a plurality of votes becomes the party in power, and where everyone has an opportunity to participate in our democracy, regardless of income level, racial identity, political preferences, and so on. And so I think that if we're measuring what impact are we having, we might think about how do we increase the percentage of people who reject the use of violence to affect or realize a political goal.
I'm with you, Joe. I'm an optimist, and I think that there are more people than not who really want to see democracy work and see it work well, even if they have very different ideas about what that might look like. So let's talk about the National Day of Dialogue and this coalition of partners that you're working with. This is such an exciting concept to me. I was so excited to bring you on to talk about it. How are we going to take a bit of a different lens and look at January 6th and hopefully that much more optimistic way this coming year?
Yeah. So the National Day of Dialogue is an effort by a range of organizations to bring people together 1 year after January 6th to engage with different perspectives, connect and build relationships with people who are different from us. I think that's necessary but not sufficient, and we shouldn't shy away from the tough conversations. And the tough conversations 1 year after January 6th are, how did this happen in the first place? Why is this likely to happen in the future, and what can we do about it? And so Urban Rural Action's approach to engaging in these tough conversations is to lean in and embrace the stance of curiosity, to spend as much time exploring the perspectives of people who have different political leanings as we do articulating our own, and to also embrace an analytical framework, to use what we call a problem tree analysis, which is a process for defining a problem, right? Pervasive political violence in our country, to map out the negative effects of that problem, which might be disengagement because people maybe are losing hope that our democracy can be salvaged, or maybe seeing political violence front and center leads to a greater willingness in the future to participate in political violence. Those are the effects potentially, but also what are the causes? Again, divisive rhetoric from our elected officials, misinformation, disinformation, loss of trust in our institutions. And on January 5th and 6th, the Urban Rural Action 1 hour events will bring Americans together to discuss what are the causes, what are the effects, and then on January 6th, the focus will be what are some solutions we could imagine to address the causes of political violence in our country.
So nice to focus on solutions, because that's what gets us there, right? That's where we all, or where many of us want to be. So talk to me more specifically about what this is going to look like. You talked about bringing people together on January 5th. Are these workshops? Are they webinars? Are they seminars, discussion groups, Urban Rural Action? And you mentioned some of your other partners are going to be doing things as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what you said a minute ago about solutions, Tracy. Brian Stevenson says that hopelessness is the enemy of justice, and it's hopelessness that allows injustice to persist. And so focusing on the solutions is really critical because, again, absent action from us, political violence is likely to persist. On January 5th, there will be a 1 hour interactive Zoom session, and people can sign up to participate on our website. We would love to have emerging leaders from EI participate. It is open to the public. We will move into small discussions on Zoom where participants have an opportunity to discuss what are causes, what are effects of political violence in our country, to ask questions about how other Americans in that Zoom room see this dynamic, to share how you view this challenge. And on January 6th, the format will be similar. It will be a 1 hour interactive Zoom session in small groups. These will be led by a Your Action moderator. And so we will be managing the process, and all you need to do, aside from signing up, is bring curiosity, a willingness to listen to different perspectives, and a willingness to share your own ideas for not just solutions, but also what do you think has led us to where we are today?
You answered one of my questions. I was wondering what the moderation of these small rooms was going to look like. So these are your trained people who do this all the time in different programs and in different formats. Wouldn't it be cool if everyone who signed up found someone who has a different point of view and said, hey, come to this with me? How much more interesting the conversation might be.
It's funny you say that, Tracy, because in our larger programs, right? Your Actions programs generally follow a cohort model. We were privileged to benefit from the support of EI for a Uniting for Action America program that a EI leader and Gettysburg College graduate, Logan Grubb, helped conceptualize for us last year. That program, we asked people to sign up with someone who was different from them in a meaningful way, because we were putting together a cohort whose composition had ideological, racial, geographic, and generational diversity. And encouraging people to invite someone who is different from them or sees the world differently is a great way to ensure that we have a group where people can learn from one another. So I love your call for January 5th and 6th. We do ask people when they register, how would you describe your political views? It's an open-ended question. It doesn't impact, of course, anyone's ability to participate. It does enable us to arrange the small group so that there's ideological diversity within those discussions.
That's great. I can't overemphasize that. I know we've just got a few minutes left. Several years ago, I was a family engagement fellow with National PTA. And one of the assignments I got as part of that fellowship was specifically to seek out someone in my community from a different area who had a very different perspective than me and do an interview with them. And so I reached out to a colleague who lived in a very different community, had a very different set of issues. We had the best 45-minute discussion about things that I was often very involved in and advocated with. But I have actually used some of her thoughts and some of her perspectives in presentations, in talks, in work groups, because it was just very enriching to be able to see things from a different perspective. So I with our emerging leaders, our students and with others, I often encourage people to do that. So there's also a film release that's going to be part of this, right? There's going to be a new documentary that's released as part of the National Day of Dialogue.
That's right. The IDEOS Institute, which is the convening organization for the National Day of Dialogue, will be releasing a film about their efforts to bring people together across divides to engage in constructive dialogue, the way that you did, Tracy, in the community. And I'll just add that, speaking about speech on campus, right? According to the Wall Street Journal, 66% of students believe it's acceptable to shout down a speaker who is expressing views that you disagree with, and 23% of students nationally believe it's acceptable to use violence to prevent someone from expressing views that you disagree with. One of the things that I admire about emerging leaders at EI and why I'm grateful for the partnership with Gettysburg College is that we need to accept that other people may have different ways of looking at the world. There's an opportunity for us to learn. I think that's what you just articulated, Tracy, is that you learn something new, you still hold on to it from those conversations. And I think part of the problem is that we approach conversations with people who have different views with the goal of changing their mind rather than the goal of understanding, of learning. And if we can change our mind, it's our mindset that leads to our actions, that leads to results. And if we can change our mindset to one of, this is an opportunity for us both to learn something new about the other's perspective, that leads to more question asking, more checking for understanding, and ultimately better relationships and things that we can hold on to even years later, the way you described.
It's funny. So many of us can just start practicing this at home, right? Yes. with our spouses, with our kids, 100%. With our teenagers. I'm sure they were like, Mom, you need to listen for understanding, not just to tell me what to do. I mean, really, it sounds comical, but it's a great way to start to practice the whole idea of listening to check for understanding, as opposed to what many of us do. I'll throw myself on the grill here, which is just to kind of get your point across, which doesn't really foster any movement at all. I have so enjoyed this conversation with you.
Me too, Tracy.
I'm looking forward to January 5th and 6th. I'm looking forward to our continued partnership. Before we go, I just want to make sure that I give you the last word to share with people how they can engage. Where can they go to register?
Thank you, Tracy. I've enjoyed the conversation as well. If you are listening and you want to participate on January 5th and or 6th, you can go to the Urban Rural Action website. That is the letter U, the letter R, action.org. And you will see up on the main page an opportunity to register. You'll click on a link and you'll be taken to a Zoom registration page and you can sign up there. We'd love to have you. And we look forward to seeing you on Zoom.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. You've made this a great day of dialogue for me. I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise. Thanks, Tracy.
See you later. Thanks, everyone.